is a photograph taken in 1953 at the coronation of Queen Elizabeth II. In the foreground, the newly crowned Queen sits radiant on the ancient throne of England, the imperial state crown on her head, the orb and sceptre in her hands. Behind her, slightly to the left, sits a small, immaculately dressed woman in pearls and pale blue. She is smiling. It is a very specific kind of smile, composed, knowing, satisfied. The smile of someone who has arranged everything exactly as it should be, and is now watching it unfold precisely on schedule. That woman was Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon, the Queen Mother, the woman the press called the most beloved figure in Britain, the woman the royal family called Mummy, the woman who, for more than 7 decades, stood just slightly behind the throne and quietly, absolutely, decisively shaped every significant decision made from it. History remembers her as a warm, gentle grandmother with a fondness for horses and hats and the occasional gin and Dubonnet. And she was those things, but she was also something far more formidable, something the careful image management of the royal family spent decades working to obscure. She was the architect, the strategist, the woman who understood, better than anyone alive, how power actually worked, and used that understanding with a precision that would have impressed Machiavelli himself. This is her real story, and if you are new here, welcome. Please hit like and subscribe before we go any further. What you are about to hear is not the fairy tale. Part 1. A girl who was never supposed to be queen. Elizabeth Angela Marguerite Bowes-Lyon was born on the 4th of August 1900 into a world that was already beginning to crack at its foundations. The Victorian era had just ended. The Edwardian age was in full, opulent swing. The great European empires were at their peak and less than 15 years from annihilation. She was the 9th of 10 children born to Claude Bowes-Lyon, the 14th Earl of Strathmore, and his wife Cecilia. They were aristocracy, comfortably, confidently so, but not royalty. Glamis Castle, the family seat in Scotland, was ancient and romantic and cold. The Bowes-Lyon children grew up with that particular combination of privilege and practicality that characterized the upper reaches of the British landed class. Servants and draughty corridors, fine manners and muddy fields, an absolute understanding of social hierarchy and an equally absolute confidence in their own place within it. Elizabeth was, by every account, exceptional from childhood. Not in the conspicuous way, not the prodigy, not the beauty in the obvious sense, not the one who immediately dominated every room. Her gift was subtler and, ultimately, more powerful than any of those things. She understood people. She read them with extraordinary accuracy. She knew instinctively what someone needed to hear to feel seen, to feel valued, to feel that Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon was on their side. And she deployed that gift with effortless, relentless precision. When the First World War came and Glamis Castle was converted to a convalescent home for wounded soldiers, Elizabeth, 14 when the war began, threw herself into the work with a focus that surprised even those who knew her well. She visited the wards. She wrote letters on behalf of soldiers who could not write for themselves. She learned names, remembered histories, brought small gifts and personal attention to men whose lives had been shattered by things no one should experience. She was, in those years, forming the skills that would define her entire public life, the ability to make every single person in her presence feel, briefly and completely, that they were the most important person in the room. It was a gift. It was also, consciously or not, a strategy. And Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon would use it to climb higher than any non-royal woman in British history. The prince who could not say no. Prince Albert, Duke of York, the second son of King George V, known to his family as Bertie, was in many ways the least likely heir to the British throne. He was shy where his brother Edward was magnetic. He struggled with a debilitating stammer that made public appearances an ordeal. He was deeply insecure in the ways that sensitive, overlooked second children often are, and he had grown up in the shadow of a charismatic older brother who the world universally preferred. He met Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon at a dance in 1920. He was 24. She was 19. He was besotted almost immediately. She was, characteristically, more measured. She turned down his first proposal, and his second. It is not entirely clear what changed between the second refusal and the third acceptance in 1923. But those who have studied Elizabeth closely suggest that she had, by that point, made a calculation. Not a cold one. She was genuinely fond of Albert, genuinely moved by his vulnerability, but a calculation nonetheless. A recognition that this quiet, struggling, overlooked prince was someone she could shape, someone whose trajectory she could determine, someone through whom, in a world that gave women almost no direct access to power, she could nevertheless exercise it. They married in April 1923 at Westminster Abbey. The crowds were enormous, the press was enchanted. Elizabeth, in her going-away outfit, paused at the tomb of the unknown warrior and laid her wedding bouquet on it, a spontaneous gesture, it was reported, of remembrance for her brother Fergus, killed in the war. Whether spontaneous or choreographed, it was perfect. It was exactly the kind of gesture that would define her public image for the next 80 years. Warm, human, perfectly timed, impossible to criticize. Part 2. The Duchess Years. Learning the Game. As Duchess of York, Elizabeth had no formal power. She was the wife of the king's second son, an important position socially, but not one that carried any particular constitutional weight. She was not expected to make decisions. She was expected to smile, to attend, to represent, to charm, to be decorative in the way that royal wives had always been decorative. She did all of those things, and while doing them, she was watching, learning, studying the institution she had married into with the focused attention of someone who intended to understand it completely, who held actual influence and who merely appeared to, which courtiers were reliable and which were self-serving, how the press could be managed, not through control, but through the strategic cultivation of warmth and accessibility that made journalists feel they were being trusted. How to be, at all times, above criticism, not through perfection, but through the careful construction of an image so fundamentally likable that criticism seemed almost indecent. She was also, during these years, doing something quietly revolutionary for a woman of her position and era. She was actively managing her husband, not in the sense of manipulation, though the line between management and manipulation is sometimes thinner than we like to admit, but in the sense of genuine, sustained, strategic support. She found the speech therapist, Lionel Logue, whose unconventional methods helped Albert manage his stammer in ways that years of conventional treatment had not. She guided his public appearances, reading the rooms and the crowds and the moods in ways that Albert himself could not always do. She protected him from the full force of his own anxiety, providing a steady external calm that compensated for the internal turbulence he could not always control. In doing this, she was not simply being a good wife, she was making herself indispensable. She was ensuring that the Duke of York could not function at his best without her, that her presence was not just pleasant but necessary, that whatever happened next, whatever the future held for the British monarchy, she would be at the centre of it. The children. Elizabeth and Albert had two daughters. Elizabeth Alexandra Mary, born in 1926, the future Queen Elizabeth II, and Margaret Rose, born in 1930. The girls were, by all accounts, genuinely loved. Elizabeth was a devoted mother in the ways that mattered most to her, present at bedtime, engaged in the small rituals of childhood, warm and demonstrative in private in ways that the public image of royal formality might not have suggested. But there was also, in Elizabeth's mothering, a dimension that went beyond affection. She was, from very early on, shaping, teaching, preparing. The elder daughter, Lilibet, as the family called her, was being formed, carefully and consistently, into something specific, into someone who understood duty before desire, who knew that the institution came first, who had internalized, as a value rather than a constraint, the idea that personal feeling must always yield to public responsibility. Whether this was the right thing to do to a child is a question that has occupied psychologists and biographers for decades. What is not in question is that it was effective. The woman Elizabeth II became steady, dutiful, unfailingly committed to the role above all else, was, in significant measure, the woman her mother had deliberately created. Part 3. The Abdication. The moment everything changed. In December 1936, King Edward VIII abdicated the throne of Great Britain, Ireland, and the British dominions beyond the seas in order to marry Wallis Simpson, an American divorcee whom the establishment, the church, and large segments of the public considered wholly unsuitable to be queen. The abdication crisis is one of the most written about events in modern royal history. It has been dramatized, romanticized, analyzed from every possible angle. What is less often examined with full honesty is what Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon, Duchess of York, thought about it, and what she did. The official position, maintained for decades, was that Elizabeth was devastated by the abdication, that having the crown thrust upon her husband was the great unwanted burden of her life, that she never forgave Wallis Simpson, not for taking Edward away, but for forcing an unwilling man onto a throne he was never meant to occupy. This was the story. This was what she wanted the world to believe. The private record is more complicated. Those with access to correspondence and private accounts from the period note that Elizabeth, in the months leading up to the abdication, was not entirely passive. She was in contact with key figures. She was aware of the negotiations. She was positioning, not crudely, not obviously, but with the quiet, steady intentionality that characterized everything she did. When the abdication came, she was ready. Not happy, the distinction matters, but ready, prepared, already thinking about what came next. What came next was the throne. Her husband became King George VI, she became Queen Consort, and the woman who had spent 13 years studying the institution from slightly outside its centre was now inside it completely, with full access, with the ear of the king, with the authority, formal and informal, to shape how the monarchy presented itself to the world. The Wallis problem. Elizabeth's treatment of Wallis Simpson, the woman who became Duchess of Windsor after the abdication, is one of the most revealing chapters of her story, and one of the least flattering. From the moment of the abdication, Elizabeth moved with deliberate, sustained purpose to ensure that Wallis was kept not merely out of the inner circle of the royal family, but out of any position of dignity or recognition that might have allowed her to represent a competing centre of attention. The most concrete expression of this was the denial of the title Her Royal Highness. Edward, upon his abdication, retained the title Duke of Windsor and His Royal Highness. Wallis, upon their marriage, received the title Duchess of Windsor, but not HRH. She was to be addressed as Her Grace, the lesser title. This distinction, seemingly technical, actually profound in the hierarchical world of royalty, meant that Wallis would always be required to curtsy to members of the royal family without receiving a curtsy in return. She would always be visibly, formally, institutionally lesser. This was not a decision made by the king alone. Those close to the situation are clear that Elizabeth drove it, argued for it, ensured it held. Over the years that followed, as Edward repeatedly petitioned for his wife to receive the HRH designation, the answer was always no. Elizabeth made sure of that. Was it personal? Undoubtedly. Elizabeth disliked Wallis Simpson with an intensity that went far beyond institutional concern. She blamed her, not entirely without reason, for the abdication and for everything the abdication had cost her family. But it was also strategic. A living, titled, respected Duchess of Windsor who appeared at court and received full royal honours was a problem, a reminder of the crisis, a competing narrative, a distraction. A marginalised, exiled Duchess of Windsor was a closed chapter. Elizabeth chose the closed chapter, and she kept it closed for the rest of her life. Part 4. The War Years. The Making of a Legend. When Germany invaded Poland in September 1939 and Britain declared war, Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon faced the most significant test of her life, and she passed it in a way that secured her public image for the next 60 years. The question in the early days of the war was whether the royal family should remain in London or evacuate to safety. The answer, which Elizabeth drove, according to those who were present, was unequivocal. They would stay. Her reported response to suggestions that the children be sent to Canada became one of the most quoted lines of the entire war. The princesses would not go without her, she would not go without the king, and the king would not go. Buckingham Palace was bombed 9 times during the Blitz. After one particularly direct hit, Elizabeth is reported to have said that she was glad that now she could look the East End in the face. She visited bombed streets and shelters and hospitals and factories. She wore the same clothes repeatedly, visibly refusing the conspicuous consumption that would have been indefensible while her people were rationing. She shook hands and listened and remembered names and asked after children and made every person she met feel, briefly and completely, that the crown was with them. It was, without question, some of the most effective public relations work in the history of the monarchy, and it was not accidental. Elizabeth understood, with a clarity that her husband, for all his genuine decency, did not always have, that the survival of the monarchy in the 20th century depended entirely on its ability to be felt as well as seen, on its ability to generate not just respect, but love, on its ability to make ordinary people feel that the institution existed for them. She gave them that feeling, consistently, brilliantly, for 6 years of war. And when it was over, the Queen Consort of Great Britain was the most beloved public figure in the country, perhaps in the world. The king behind the Queen, George VI, died in February 1952 at the age of 56. He had been ill for years, lung cancer, though the full diagnosis was not publicly disclosed. He had been a good king, broadly speaking, conscientious, dedicated, genuinely concerned with the welfare of his people. History has been kind to him, and not without reason. But those who knew the reign from the inside have always been clear about something that the public image somewhat obscured. George VI was the king. Elizabeth was the power. Not in every domain. She had no interest in the technical machinery of governance, the parliamentary processes, the cabinet briefings. but in the things that mattered to the survival and the image and the direction of the monarchy, in the decisions about people, about presentation, about which relationships to cultivate and which to manage, about how the institution should position itself in a rapidly changing world. It was Elizabeth who decided, and it was Elizabeth whose decisions held. The king knew this. By most accounts, he was content with it, even grateful. He trusted her judgment more completely than he trusted his own, and he had good reason to. In the areas where she was directing him, she was almost never wrong. She read the public mood with extraordinary accuracy. She understood what the monarchy needed to do to survive, and she was willing to make the hard, cold calculations that he, with his fundamental decency and his own emotional needs, sometimes found difficult. Part 5. The Queen Mother. Power without a title. When George VI died and Elizabeth II ascended the throne, Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon became something that the British monarchy had not had in a very long time. A Queen Mother, a former Queen Consort whose husband had died and whose child now reigned. It was a position with no formal power whatsoever, no constitutional role, no seat at the table of governance. A ceremonial position essentially, present at state occasions, representing continuity, available to smile and wave and remind the public of a golden past. Most people in that position would have accepted its limits and withdrawn gracefully into a dignified semi-retirement. Elizabeth did not accept its limits. She simply ignored them. She remained at the centre of royal life with a tenacity that those around her found by turns inspiring and occasionally suffocating. She maintained her own household, a substantial one, running at a cost to the public purse that would later generate significant controversy. She kept her own social circle, her own schedule, her own network of contacts that reached into every significant institution in British life. And she maintained, with remarkable subtlety, her influence over the one person who mattered most, her daughter, the Queen. The relationship between Elizabeth II and the Queen Mother is one of the most carefully managed silences in modern royal history. We know very little about its internal dynamics because both women were, in their different ways, extraordinarily disciplined about privacy. But the evidence available, from courtiers, from biographers with access to private correspondence, from the patterns of decision-making over 5 decades, suggests a relationship of profound complexity. Elizabeth II loved her mother. That is not in question. But the Queen Mother's influence on her daughter's approach to the monarchy, on the values Elizabeth II embodied, the decisions she made, the way she understood the institution's relationship to the public, was total and permanent. She had been shaping it since her daughter was an infant. She continued shaping it through direct conversation and indirect pressure and the simple authority of her presence, until she was too old and too ill to have conversations at all. The decisions she shaped. It is worth tracing concretely some of the significant royal decisions of the second half of the 20th century in which the Queen Mother's influence can be directly or circumstantially identified. The treatment of the Duke and Duchess of Windsor. Already discussed, but it bears noting that the policy of exclusion Elizabeth established in 1937 held with remarkable consistency for decades. When Edward died in 1972, Wallis was brought to London for the funeral, but the visit was managed with exquisite care to ensure that it represented no acknowledgement of past error. Elizabeth controlled the narrative to the end, and after the end. The handling of Princess Margaret's relationship with Peter Townsend. The official account presents this as a decision driven by the Church and the government. The less official account supported by multiple sources close to the family, suggests that the Queen Mother's private counsel to her elder daughter was decisive, that she advised Elizabeth II, in terms that could not be misunderstood, that permitting the marriage would create precisely the kind of constitutional crisis that the monarchy could not afford so soon after the abdication. Whether this counsel was right is debatable. That it was given and that it carried enormous weight is not. The response to Diana. Here, the Queen Mother's influence is perhaps most contested and most significant. Diana Spencer arrived in the royal family as everything the Queen Mother had always been: beautiful, naturally gifted at human connection, capable of generating the kind of public love that the monarchy needed to survive. She was also everything the Queen Mother had never been: unwilling to subordinate her own emotional needs to the institution, unable to perform the necessary internal suppression that royal life demanded, increasingly and publicly unhappy. The Queen Mother's view of Diana, never stated publicly, carefully managed in private, appears to have been one of fundamental incomprehension shading into concern. She saw, perhaps more clearly than anyone, what Diana represented: a challenge to the model of monarchy she had spent her entire life constructing and defending. A person whose emotional authenticity was, from the institution's perspective, a liability. A woman who did not understand, or did not accept, the first rule of royal survival: that the institution always comes before the individual. Part 6. The debts, the spending, the secrets. No portrait of the Queen Mother would be complete or honest without addressing the aspects of her life that the official image worked hardest to conceal. And chief among these was money. Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon spent money with a freedom that had almost no relationship to the actual size of her income. She maintained multiple homes: Clarence House in London, the Royal Lodge in Windsor Great Park, the Castle of May in Caithness, which she purchased and restored at considerable expense. She kept a household staff that, by the end of her life, numbered over 100 people. She entertained lavishly. She dressed impeccably and expensively. She bet on horses with genuine enthusiasm and, it must be said, not always rewarding results. By the time of her death in 2002, the Queen Mother had accumulated personal debts estimated at somewhere between £4 and £7 million. The exact figure has never been fully confirmed, because the details were managed with the same careful discretion that surrounded everything else about her finances. The debts were quietly settled by the Queen from private funds. The official civil list allowance, the money provided by the government to support the Queen Mother's official duties, had by the 1990s become a source of genuine public controversy. Questions were raised in Parliament. Journalists calculated, with increasing boldness, the cost per official engagement. The numbers were not flattering. But what is remarkable and revealing about the nature of her power is how little this controversy ever threatened her. She had built, over 70 years of public life, a reserve of goodwill so enormous that it was genuinely impervious to ordinary scandal. The public, presented with evidence of extraordinary expenditure, tended to respond not with anger, but with something approaching fond indulgence. She was the Queen Mother. She had earned it. She deserved it. Let her have her racing and her champagne and her 100 staff. She had stood in the rubble of the Blitz. She had given them everything. She could spend whatever she liked. This is the most perfect possible demonstration of what Elizabeth had built. Not just an image, a kind of national emotional investment so deep and so personal that it operated completely independently of rational assessment. She had made people love her, and people who love you do not do the arithmetic. The drinking that no one mentioned. The Queen Mother's fondness for gin, specifically gin and dubonnet, a fortified wine, reportedly in a ratio of 2 parts gin to 1 part dubonnet with a slice of lemon, was an open secret that somehow remained, for most of her public life, entirely absent from serious press coverage. Those who knew her well speak of a daily consumption that would, in any ordinary citizen, have generated significant concern. Morning drinks, lunchtime drinks, afternoon drinks, evening drinks at dinner, nightcaps. The quantity was, by most accounts, substantial. The effect was, by most accounts, remarkably contained. She was almost never visibly impaired, almost never anything less than precisely, formidably herself. The press did not write about it, not because they did not know, they knew, but because the Queen Mother had cultivated, across decades, a relationship with the British press that was based on a kind of mutual understanding. She would give them access, warmth, the occasional perfectly quotable line, the human moments that made for irresistible copy, and they would protect her. Not formally, not explicitly, but consistently and completely. This, too, was power. The power to determine what was said about you. The power to make the people who controlled the narrative feel that protecting you was something they wanted to do, rather than something they were required to. Elizabeth managed the press the way she managed everything, not through force, but through the creation of a relationship in which the other party found it genuinely in their interest to behave the way she needed them to. Part 7. A Century of Survival. Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon lived to be 101 years old. She was born in the reign of Queen Victoria. She died in the reign of her granddaughter. In between, she had witnessed and shaped more history than almost any other individual of the 20th century. She had been present for 2 world wars, the end of empire, the transition from a world in which the British monarchy was the centre of a global system to a world in which it was, essentially, a national institution that survived on the strength of its emotional appeal. She had watched the world change beyond recognition and had adapted, not by changing herself, which she was never inclined to do, but by finding ways to make what she was feel perpetually relevant. The secret, if there was one, was consistency. Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon at 90 was the same person, in all the ways that mattered, that Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon had been at 30. The same warmth, the same precision, the same absolute certainty about who she was and what she was for. In a century defined by upheaval and uncertainty, she offered something the public found genuinely comforting, a person who appeared to have no doubts, who seemed to know, always, exactly what she was doing and why. Whether she actually had no doubts is another matter. She was a disciplined enough private person that the interior life has remained almost entirely hidden. What we have is the performance, extraordinary, sustained, and so technically accomplished that it became impossible to distinguish from the genuine article. Perhaps, by the end, even she could not tell the difference. The last years. In her final decade, the Queen Mother was visibly diminished in physical terms, while remaining to those who encountered her formidably present. She had a series of health setbacks, hip replacements, a severe bout of illness, the loss of mobility that comes inevitably with extreme age. She used a walking frame, then a wheelchair. She required more assistance, more managing, more careful tending. But she did not withdraw. She continued to appear publicly, carefully, with appropriate support, with the same attention to presentation that had always characterized her public life. She attended the races, she hosted, she received visitors, she maintained the rituals and the relationships and the carefully managed social world that had always been her primary domain. And she held on. Through the death of Princess Margaret on the 9th of February 2002, her younger daughter, her difficult, beloved second child, the one who had been most shaped by her and perhaps most damaged by that shaping, the Queen Mother attended the funeral. Those who were present say she seemed, in those days, finally to be releasing something, as though Margaret's death had lifted a weight that had been present for decades. 7 weeks later, on the 30th of March 2002, Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon died at Windsor Castle. She was 101 years old. She died as she had lived, with her daughter at her side. Part 8. What she actually built. The public response to the Queen Mother's death was one of the largest outpourings of national grief in British history. Hundreds of thousands of people filed past her coffin as she lay in state in Westminster Hall. The queue stretched for miles. People waited for hours in the cold. They left flowers and letters and photographs. They wept openly. They spoke of her as though they had known her personally, because she had spent a century creating the feeling that they had. The tributes were universal and overwhelming, from political leaders across the spectrum, from former enemies of Britain, from people who had met her once, briefly, decades ago, and remembered it for the rest of their lives. The image was consistent, a woman of extraordinary warmth, extraordinary grace, extraordinary courage. The nation's grandmother, the last link to a greater time. It was everything she had worked for, everything she had built. And it was real, which is, perhaps, the most remarkable thing about it. The warmth was genuine, the courage was genuine, the care was genuine. The woman who had spent a century managing her image had not, in the end, created a fiction. She had created a version of herself that was, simultaneously, completely constructed and completely true. That is the measure of the achievement. Not the deception, but the absence of it. She had wanted to be beloved. She had worked, with extraordinary discipline, to become someone worth loving, and she had succeeded, on both counts, at once. The shadow on the legacy. And yet, the legacy of the Queen Mother is not without its shadows. The treatment of Wallis Simpson, sustained, strategic, unforgiving, is difficult to defend in retrospect. Whatever Simpson's faults, whatever the genuine institutional concern she represented, the decades-long campaign to deny her dignity and recognition was personal as much as political. It was a use of power that served Elizabeth's own interests as much as the monarchy's. The shaping of Elizabeth II, so complete, so thorough, so effective at producing a woman of unwavering institutional loyalty, also produced a woman who found it genuinely difficult, in moments of personal and national crisis, to respond as a human being first. The famous silence during the week after Diana's death, the refusal to fly the flag at half-mast, the apparent inability to recognize what the public needed in that moment. These failures, and they were failures, were not accidental. They were the direct product of a set of values about the monarchy's relationship to emotion that the Queen Mother had spent 50 years instilling. Princess Margaret's story, the Townsend affair, the marriage to Snowdon, the Mystique years, the long decline, is also in part the Queen Mother's story. Margaret was shaped by the same force that shaped her sister, but where Elizabeth II had the throne to anchor her, a purpose to organize herself around, Margaret had nothing of equivalent weight. She had been given the same formation and a fundamentally different destiny. The collision between those two things was, in significant measure, her tragedy. And the woman most responsible for the formation was her mother. None of this negates the achievement, but it complicates the legend. And complicated legends are, in the end, more true. Part 9. The Woman Behind the Crown. A final assessment. She ruled them all. That is not an exaggeration. Not through formal authority, she held none for most of her life. Not through threat or coercion, that was never her method. But through the patient, relentless, extraordinarily skilled exercise of influence over the people, the institutions, and the narratives that actually determined how the British monarchy functioned and what it meant. She shaped a king who was not supposed to be one. She shaped a queen who would reign for 70 years. She shaped the public's understanding of what the monarchy was for. She shaped the press's relationship with the royal family. She shaped the institution's response to the crises of the 20th century. Abdication, war, social revolution, the collapse of deference, with a consistency and a clarity of purpose that no one else in the family possessed. And she did all of this while being, in the public imagination, primarily a warm grandmother who liked horses and gin and talking to strangers. That was not despite the image, it was because of it. The warmth was the weapon, the accessibility was the strategy, the flowers and the smiles and the perfectly remembered names were the mechanism through which real, lasting, structural power was exercised. There will be those who resist this framing, who find it reductive or cynical or unfair to a woman whose genuine virtues were substantial. And they are not entirely wrong. The virtues were real, the warmth was real, the courage, standing in the bombed streets of London, refusing to leave when leaving would have been entirely justified, was real. But real virtue and strategic intelligence are not mutually exclusive. A person can be genuinely kind and also a consummate political operator. A person can love deeply and also calculate precisely. Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon was all of these things, simultaneously and inseparably. To reduce her to only the warmth is to misunderstand her. To reduce her to only the strategy is to misunderstand her differently. The truth requires holding both at once. She was the most powerful woman in 20th century Britain who never held formal power. She was the architect of the modern monarchy, its values, its image, its survival strategy. She was a mother who loved her children and shaped them, sometimes painfully, into what the institution required. She was a widow who refused to become invisible and instead became more present than she had ever been. She was 100 years of history, walking through rooms and shaking hands and making people feel seen. She ruled them all, and most of them never even knew it. Epilogue. What she left behind. The monarchy that exists today, changed as it is, challenged as it is, struggling as it sometimes appears to with the demands of a world that no longer extends automatic deference to ancient institutions, is still, in its fundamental structure, the monarchy that Elizabeth built. Its commitment to continuity over personality. Its understanding that survival depends on emotional connection with the public. Its deeply ingrained instinct to manage, to contain, to present a composed face to the world, regardless of what is happening behind it. Its reflexive protection of the institution over the individuals within it. All of this traces back, in direct and traceable line, to the values she instilled over 7 decades at its center. Whether those values are the right ones for the 21st century is a live question. The monarchy has faced crises in recent years that the Queen Mother's playbook has not always been adequate to address. The public, particularly younger generations, are less willing to extend the kind of uncritical emotional investment that sustained the institution through the 20th century. The press is less deferential. The scrutiny is more total. The ability to manage the narrative, the skill Elizabeth possessed above all others, is harder to exercise in a world of social media and streaming documentaries and tell-all interviews watched by 50 million people simultaneously. But it is also possible that what she built was more durable than it sometimes appears, that the foundations are deeper than the current turbulence suggests, that an institution which survived 2 world wars, an abdication, a revolution in social values, the death of empire, and the loss of virtually every other European monarchy, might have resources of resilience that we have not yet fully measured. If it does survive, if, 100 years from now, there is still a British monarchy, still a throne at the centre of that ancient island's complicated identity, then among the reasons for that survival, her name will be one of the first. The woman behind every royal decision. The woman who ruled them all. Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon, Queen Consort, Queen Mother. The most powerful woman you never quite noticed ruling you.